Good evening. It's April 5th, and we're welcoming Rev Sandhya Jha to speak on behalf of the Interfaith Council of Contra Costa County. We are 109 congregations, monasteries, and retreat centers that do our work together, protecting religious minorities, religious freedom, interfaith service, and care for those in juvenile hall. Singing messengers and many, many different things. We invite you to take a look at all of our programming at interfaithccc.org. As interfaith councils, we understand land acknowledgements as a transformative act meant to confront our place on native lands and to build mindfulness of our present participation in colonial legacies. As people of various faith traditions and life philosophies, we affirm our responsibility to amplify Indigenous voices. We stand in solidarity with local Indigenous communities, and we respect local Indigenous protocol. We practice land acknowledgements in order to teach and promote greater public consciousness of Native sovereignty and cultural rights, even here in California, where there are few First Nations that survived the California Indigenous genocide and fewer still that gained federal recognition as sovereign nations. We recognize that the cultural heritage of California began no less than 15,000 years ago, and that the entire Bay Area rests on evidence of Indigenous cultures. The pre-contact Indigenous population in California was one of the largest and most diverse in the Western Hemisphere and spoke over 300 Native American dialects in as many as 90 languages. Today, there are approximately 9 Indigenous dialects spoken in the Bay Area, and California is home to more people of Native American and Alaskan Native heritage than any other state in the country. There are currently over 100 federally recognized Native American tribes in California, and even more communities and tribal groups, including the Ohlone, who are not currently federally recognized. California has the highest Native American population in the country, and Los Angeles and San Francisco have 2 of the largest urban Native American populations in the United States. We're glad to have Reverend Sandhya back with us today and tonight to continue another kind of cutting edge workshop that she's put together called The Power of Anti-Racism. She's been one of our teachers in this series and has done some great teaching on systemic racism as well, really helping that. And I have to say still, Reverend Sandhya, that your teaching on systemic racism was among the best that I've had on that particular topic still today. So thank you so much for being here with us, and thank you for leading us tonight.
I'm thrilled to be with you all. I was mentioning to Will that I love the opportunity to delve into terrain that's a little bit newer for me. This is stuff I have been wrestling with and applying and working with in my own faith and also nonprofit work. I've done a few workshops around this theme, but this is the first time it's coming together in this particular format. So we're actually co-learning this evening. And I wanted to let you know that in the hopes that it doesn't alarm you so much as gives you a sense of freedom to think, oh, that doesn't work for me. I'll let Sandhya know that later. Or, oh, that's interesting. I wonder if Sandhya thought about this. I am delighted to get that input. Keep the chat box going. And also, this is a little less content heavy. If you came to the workshop on systemic racism, that one had a lot of information. I think I joked with you all that I squeezed a day and a half or 2.5 days of content into, I think we did it in 90 minutes. This won't be quite as intense as that, although I will reference back to the working definition of racism as part of our conversation today. Where I wanted to start the conversation is very simply to do a quick check-in, because the subject for today is the power of anti-racism. And just to give away, to not bury the lead, part of why I call it that is I think that many of us who are seeking to create justice, especially those of us who are spiritually rooted people, we have an ambivalent relationship to power. And so I wanted to start out with a question that helps us think of power not necessarily as a bad thing. So my check-in question for us is, what is it that makes you feel powerful? I'm actually going to ask that of the group, and it is always rude to make other people answer a question first. So I'll let you all know. Some of you know that I do a lot of work with the Reverend B.K. Woodson. He's really involved out there in Contra Costa County. I'm all the way over in Alameda County. He does a lot of work out there with Faith in Action East Bay. And he and I do a few courses together at Allen Temple Baptist Church here in Oakland. And in one of the courses, he taught the students the power of embodiment. And so a very silly exercise that the students would do with each other before they gave presentations was to simply put their arms up in a big V, because there's science that shows when you do that and you stretch out your body and you've got your arms up, it literally triggers the chemicals in your body that give you a sense of power, of self-confidence. And so it's a fun way to tap into the power that we have within us, especially when we're doing something as scary as speaking in public. So for me, something as simple as doing the big V sign makes me feel a little more powerful. In other circumstances, I would have made you do that with me, but I'm going to be kind this evening. So if you have things that make you feel powerful, you are welcome to, yay! I love it. I love it. See the power kicking into your bodies. Oh, that's another good one, Diane. Yes. Love it. Love it. Those are great. Power positions make a difference. I love it. So
I just read something last week about this one with your hands on your hips as a way of calming yourself, but also reminding you that you have the power to do and the energy to do what you need in the moment.
It doesn't, yeah, it taps into something different, right? It helps you feel grounded in yourself. So this one's a little more high energy. That one's a calming, but also powerful position. Yes. So are there other things that help people feel powerful? I love the one in the chat box that says, when others listen to my perspectives and then take action consistent with my recommendation. That gives us a sense of self-worth and value that can help us recognize that we do have power. That's a great one.
For me, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I think for me is the one is the active listening. For me, it's knowing that they're actually listening to me and not dismissing my feelings.
Yeah.
And then also just the confidence that people would bring me up. Because I already have, like, for me personally, I have like low self-esteem. So like when people are building me up, that like gives me that sense of power and like type of thing. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. Knowing that people hear us, knowing that we are being heard can really help us recognize that we are powerful, that we have things that are worth contributing. And I really do believe in the power of community. And so that sense that other people are invested in me can help me recognize my power. I hear you on that. Those are great. Any others?
I feel powerful when I'm riding fast on my bicycle. But also, I'm a therapist, and when I have done something which really brings up a response, like a healing thing, or when somebody says how much I've changed their life, those make me feel really, I guess powerful is one word, but effective perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Those are great examples. Love these. Thank you so much for being willing to share. So we're already kind of tapping into the fact that power is not just a negative thing, right? That there are ways in which power is a beautiful thing. And not always, but it can be. Yeah, Will.
Well, I was just going to say, sometimes when I finished a big project, that's when I feel the most.
Yes. That sense of accomplishment. Look at what I did.
Especially something new.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. I love that. Well, keep holding that in mind as we continue with this conversation. I don't know if any of you have done this exercise before. It comes from Theater of the Oppressed, and it's usually done live, where a collection of chairs is put at the front of a room, and then we have a conversation about which of these is the power chair. Which of these is the power chair? And I'm going to invite you to, I can't see you because I had to close the images so that I could make sure you can see my whole screen. So I'm going to trust you to jump into the conversation and let me know. Tell us which one of the numbers 1 through 6 is the power chair, and tell us why. As you can tell,
Are you
any
sharing
of
your
these
screen?
answers is okay. Yeah, are you not seeing it?
I just, I'm not. I don't know if
I do.
others are.
Yeah, I see it.
I see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can there be more than one? Because I have like different like opinions.
Make an argument for a couple of them. Yeah.
Okay. So first off the bat is the number 1, because Game of Thrones, that's the Iron Throne. So like that gives off the I'm the one in charge ruler, and then on top of it, very intimidating with all the swords.
It is.
The 2 is more the, I guess you can say, more traditional, like where we think of like a king or queen. They're in this big golden chair. And then my last one is 3, because it kind of brings me of the video game. So it's like that power chair
Oh,
of like
yeah.
video games. It kind of gives that feel.
It
So,
does. It's one of those ergonomic chairs.
yeah.
Absolutely. Those are all great answers. Anybody want to affirm or point out how one of the other chairs might be a power chair?
I'm going to go with number 3. I think number 1 is just a virtual power chair. Number 2 is an outdated power chair. Number 3 is a corporate power chair, and there is a lot of power in the heads of organizations, particularly for-profit organizations. So that's the one I would say is the power chair for today.
Love it. I love it.
I would say 1 and 4 have the whitest bases.
Oh,
And so they're the
from
most
a stability
stable.
standpoint.
They're not a chair you can lean back in.
You're right. You're right.
Oh, Reverend Will, I can lean back in any chair.
Well, I kind of wonder if number 5 could also communicate power in that, you can just be kind of not having to be at attention. You can just be relaxed. You got it made, comfortable. There could be some power in being able to sit in that one.
Absolutely. There's a little side table so you can put your snacks on it. I feel like anybody who has gotten to a point where they can put their feet up and have their snacks at their side has made some life choices that show that they have some control over their lives.
That looks more like maybe Ben's chair while he's listening to clients. But actually, I've always dreamed of having something like a couch with a cup of coffee and just look at my students and say, play that again.
Well,
I wonder.
Go ahead.
My chair that I use for clients is nothing like any of these. I use a kneeling chair.
Oh, right.
Because that
Interesting.
lets me stay upright, and it's not a power chair at all. I used to have one where I could lean back, but it was it was having a bad effect on my back.
So I'm curious, number 6 looks like it could be a student's chair. So thinking of, knowledge is power and
Yep.
the ability to get an education. Just there could be some tie to feeling empowered if you're able to be in a classroom and learning.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think what's interesting about this one to me is, depending on how you think about power, any of them could be the power chair. And they are all representing power in different ways, because if any of you have read the book, The Game of Thrones, they talk about how you couldn't sit comfortably in that chair because since it was made out of swords, you would actually get cut. So to think about the fact that to take that chair means you can never sit in comfort, I think is an interesting way of understanding power, also individualized power, also being wrapped up in risk. I think they're all potentially power chairs. I think number 4 is an interesting one to think of as a power chair because it's a dining room chair. And we were talking earlier about sometimes one of the things that can make some of us feel comfortable is knowing we've got community supporting us. And if we're not thinking of power just as an individualized thing, but as a community thing, chair 4 reminds us of a dining room table and the people we gather with. Chair 6 reminds us of the community that's learning together and the power of collective wisdom. I think there are interesting arguments to be made for all of these, depending on how we identify power. And some of them are focused on individuals, and some of them remind us of community. My parents bought matching lazy boy chairs when they retired. And so whenever I see that number 5, I always think of my parents being like, this is what winning looks like. We can prop up our feet and let the cat climb up into our lap and doze all morning long. To me, that's pretty powerful. So yeah, I think for us to be thinking about power in diverse ways is really important, and how we're trained to think about it often. And the people who often have power over us show up in those, maybe not the first chair, and maybe not these days in the second chair, but certainly in the third chair a lot of the time. So this gets to that question, how do we understand power? Some of you may have heard of Starhawk, who is from the pagan community and very powerful leader within that religious community. And she talks about 3 types of power, and then there's an additional one from other organizing communities that's been added to. So she talks about power over being the first form of power, totalitarian power, control, the person who's in charge. She always thinks of that as a negative. I think there's conversation that we could have about whether that's true, but Starhawk's analysis leads her to believe anti-hierarchical models are always better. So she doesn't think of power over as a positive one. But regardless of how you feel about power over, most of us have had the experience of someone being in charge over us and having decision-making power over us, even if that was just a parent, but it might be a boss, it might be in a less than ideal situation, it might be a partner. But power over is one form of power. Another form of power is power with, which in more recent days, Starhawk has started referring to as power among. That's when we recognize ourselves as part of a collective and what we can do when we gather power with each other. A lot of community organizing is based on the fact that since other people have power over us, they're legislators or they're our bosses, the power we have is the power of the people. When we gather together with a shared commitment, we can take on the power over through our power among or power with. The power 2 or the power 4 is another form of power. That's what I am able to do, what I have my own individual power to do. Power 4, I added in because in faith-rooted organizing, which is the model of organizing I come out of, we don't just pay attention to what am I able to accomplish, it's towards what end? What is the purpose of my power? And when I pay attention to that, I might become aware of ways that I have power over a situation that I might not notice otherwise. And that's the more spiritual orientation when we talk about power. And the last is power from within. That's what some people refer to as the divine spark or the spirit or the sacred that resides within us, or our sense of self-worth and our understanding of our own value, particularly in the face of other people telling us we're not valuable. When we can draw on something even when someone else is trying to undermine us, that's what Starhawk means when she talks about power from within. So 4 different types of power. There we go. So as we think about power, I wanted to revisit the definition of racism that I shared with the Interfaith Council. I think it was a year ago when we did the workshop on institutional systemic racism. I wanted to introduce it because it's a familiar definition to many people who have taken a class in sociology. It is a definition that anti-racism activists have been using for 40 years now. It is a definition that in 2021 was added to the Merriam-Webster dictionary. It's not the default definition for racism in this country yet, but a lot of work has gone into shifting things so that it is increasingly our definition. And the definition of racism that, like I said, has been used in a lot of academic circles. It's also been, if you've read the book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Beverly Daniel Tatum, or if you've read White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, both of them reference this definition. So the definition I'm going to share here is racism equals race prejudice plus institutional or systemic power. When we talk about prejudice, we just mean to prejudge, to judge without information. But when we pair prejudice with race and the way it's been constructed in very intentional ways in this country over the past 400 years, we're talking about prejudging people based on categories that have been imposed on them by others. Race prejudice. When that is paired with power in systems and institutions, that's when we get racism. So that may not be the definition you use. It may not be the definition people around you use. It's the definition I'm using for the course of our conversation today. I wanted to introduce it for that reason, but also because you'll notice the word power shows up in this definition. In this definition, what we mean by power is access and control. Access and control. Access to resources, access to information, access to people in positions of authority. Control over outcomes, control over narrative, control over cultural framings. So access and control is the way we understand power in this definition of racism. Before I go on, let me just check to see if there are any questions anybody has about that, or any comments or any experiences you've had with that definition. If that being the case, oh, go ahead, Ben, please. I'm
willing to grant you the definition for this course, but it kind of implies that a random, say, white person who stabs a random Asian woman is not racist because there's no systemic power in that act.
I think where the systemic power lies in the way he's, let's assume, shaped into his understanding of his superiority or her being a threat. Those are both culturally derived. So I think that's where the systemic or institutional power would come from, is the narrative that taught him to believe in the danger of her, or the provocativeness of her, if we're thinking about the Atlanta shootings, which were based very much in, so this is interesting because it was an individual act, but it's an individual act that was shaped by a church culture that taught him about women, and particularly about Asian women. So that's what's functioning in the background. So even individual acts can be shaped by this definition. And that's the part that doesn't get talked about very much. This is where we tend to get very quickly into, it was a mental health issue. Yeah, it's a mental health issue that was paired with training into racist understandings of how the world worked that shaped how he acted out in very specific ways. It's a great question. I really appreciate you asking it, because it's kind of subtle. Racism often, not always, but often is pretty subtle. Yeah.
Welcome, Shara.
Hello.
Hi there.
And Christine from our governing board is joining as well. So
Great.
we'll welcome some new folks. We're in just the first few 30 minutes or so of the training, and we're defining racism.
Thank you.
So I'm going to put that back up on the screen. And the reason that it's so germane to our conversation, and I think is important to name, is that aspect of power, and power being access and control. So the powers of racism in this definition, the ways they, the manifestations of racism, I just realized that was a mistake, are personal, cultural, and institutional, the ways they show up in the world. They show up in individual acts that are shaped by this narrative of, we might say, white supremacy culture. So the ways in which we engage each other based on how we've been trained to understand each other and how we've been trained to understand a racial hierarchy show up in the world. Cultural racism is another manifestation of racism. The ways in which our culture perpetuates bias, perpetuates stereotypes, perpetuates narratives of whose way of doing things is superior or treated as the norm. And institutional racism, that manifestation of racism, is how racism shows up in the ways we do business, our modes of governance, our bylaws, our constitution even. So that's another manifestation of racism. So that can show up in individual acts, interpersonal. It can show up in the way our culture functions and what we treat as normative, what's considered exotic, what's considered outside the norm, what's considered culturally unacceptable. Those are the ways that racism can show up in our culture. And then institutionally, how it can show up in our laws, our modes of governance, the way we run our organizations, the unspoken rules of how our industry functions. Those are the manifestations of racism. And so I think the question for our time together is, what are the powers of anti-racism? How can we recognize our power to address racism in interpersonal engagement in our individual acts? How can we practice anti-racism in the places where we have power in our relationships. So that would be personal anti-racism. Where do we have power to change the culture so that it is not a culture that treats some things as normative and other things as outside the norm because of the races of the people involved? How do we practice institutional anti-racism? How do we bake into our governing documents, into our mission statements, into the ways in which we provide services to clients? How do we do those in ways that are actively dismantling bias and cultures of white supremacy? And how do those intersect with our different understandings of power? Remember, we talked about how there's power over, there's power with, there's power to, and there's power from within. I'm going to put out what is maybe a bold claim, and I'm going to invite you in the chat box to push back on this if I've got it wrong. This has been my experience. This is the part of the workshop that is me testing out my 15 years of sitting with this concept and just now starting to language it. Is I think that there are some dangerous analogies that happen in progressive spaces. I talked about this at the very beginning of our time together. And I think that what goes on is this notion that bullies have power, bullies are bad, and therefore power is bad. So rather than saying, how do we use our power to take on bullies, a lot of folks shy away from admitting they have power because of that association with power being bad. And that's a failure of the understanding of the 4 different types of power. But it's also, I think, a desire to avoid responsibility for the places where we do have power. In fact, some people are taught not to believe they have power when they do. And so I think the danger of this is it causes people with power or privilege to deny their power, which means that power gets used harmfully instead of helpfully. I'm going to pause here for a second and see what thoughts people have about that before I go on. Does that resonate? Does it seem like I'm missing something? Are there things that you want to name that that are a part of that or that are different than that? Just how did that land? Thanks for the comment in the chat box.
I actually agree 100% with this, by the way. I don't know if we can open up our mics. Sorry.
Please
Yes.
do. Yeah.
Okay. I 100% agree with this because as somebody who has been in situations where I've encountered racism, one of the biggest and most disappointing things is when I see friends who have power to say something, not speak up. Friends who have influence with other people, and oftentimes white culture only listens to white culture. So in those instances, it's really important for people to use their voices and their power when they can.
I think that's very much where it came from for me, was the number of conversations I've had with other folks who are like, where people will come to me afterwards and say, that was awful. I'm sorry that happened to you. And I'm like, you were in the same meeting as me. That would have been a great time to point that out.
Yeah, I think a lot of people want to stay out of the mix and of the heat of the conversation because it's a scary conversation to have, but it's one of the most powerful conversations you can have.
Yeah.
I remember having a lot of conversations like that in seminary, and I think part of it was trying to make sure that I was a part of healthy use of power.
Mhm.
But I think there was such a in seminary, you're learning so many ways that you can your ministry, what your hope is your ministry to others, as a measure of grace and love and compassion will be that. But we know that from time to time, sometimes without our recognizing it, we become a part of the problem. I wonder if we could do a survey of even the Protestant Reformation to see how organizations changed the way they're organized and their polity as an answer to this question. Because I bet the Presbyterian Church became the denomination with checks and balances because of the misuse of power. But even knowing that, there are other different ways that you can exert power with Robert's Rules of Order in ways that strip people of their ability to have voice and vote very quickly.
Absolutely.
And if you don't understand the system and how it can be used in that way, you may not recognize when other people are doing that to you in a large group decision-making process.
And I think that's why this conversation is so important. So I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think when we don't have a power analysis, we think, oh, if we follow these rules, everybody's protected. And if we don't bring a certain analysis of how is power being used within this structure. And it's interesting because I work with a lot of, so I should have mentioned I'm a full-time anti-oppression consultant. I work with a lot of nonprofits and also religious organizations of various backgrounds. And often, if they're doing this work, they're thinking, okay, we follow Robert's rules. We know the ways in which that can be utilized to stifle dissent and disagreement and protect the status quo. So what's the model we use instead? And often the model that they're looking to use instead is the consensus model. If any of you have friends who are Quakers, they will be very quick to tell you it is very easy for someone who is not of goodwill to manipulate the consensus process, to stall out new ways of doing things and to preserve the status quo. And so it's interesting because when we engage this question of power analysis in governance to make sure that marginalized folks are being protected, or that people on the margins have full voice and get to contribute to the direction of an organization, sometimes the solution isn't the model of governance we use, it's being aware of how power is being manipulated regardless of the model we're using. And that's very rare to find in an institution, because institutions of a certain age in particular are oriented towards self-preservation. And self-preservation doesn't tend to go along with anti-oppression. That's what makes this work challenging, because it is going against, to say it's going against the status quo is maybe obvious, but it's going against what the institution defaults to, right? It goes against stability. Stability is not always good, but
even the stability of congregationalism.
Yeah.
Right, because that can be very stable, and you want to give everyone voice and vote, and that's one way of guaranteeing it. But it's also a way of slowing down your decision-making process.
Yeah.
Depending on the size of your organization. Ian has something for us. I see him.
Yeah, please.
He's waiting.
No, and
Please.
I think also too is it can also, on the personal level, the friendships that whoever is that power leader holds control of the entire group. And then when that one person feels not protected and they speak out, they're not being controlled of the narrative. And so I think there's that aspect of that personal relationship level that people aren't aware. Like, for me personally, like I wasn't aware of it. And then when it was like brought to my attention, I was like, oh my, like, holy, like I was just like, wow. And so like opens your eyes, but then that conflict of not wanting to change and not see it as racism. And that's where that problem lies.
I think it's kind of like self-protection. It's like in our nature to deny that we could be wrong on these things because it shakes the foundation of your beliefs and your upbringing and your place in society. And so it's a very scary thing for people to want to internalize because it feels like an attack on themselves.
Yeah. I think that's one of the interesting things that I'm beginning to realize is I didn't define white supremacy culture at the beginning, and I apologize for that. And I'm using it kind of interchangeably with racism, the way we've defined it. So what I mean by white supremacy culture is a culture that prioritizes and functions for the benefit of white people based on a very subtle but very real assumption that white ways of being are the better ways of being. Tema Okun has done a lot of work on that and has the 14 characteristics of white supremacy culture, one of which is around being right, and this notion that the worst thing in the world is to be wrong, right? And so in some ways, people of color are at an advantage. As people who have been told our whole lives that we are less than, that we are not normal, that we function outside of the baseline, we're used to that notion of not needing to be perfect, not needing to get it right, because no matter how hard we work, we'll never be fully right. The pressure that is created for white people to always be right means that the cost of admitting that one is wrong is huge, because it's not just I got the thing wrong. It goes back to I am wrong and therefore I am bad. It's an attack on the person in a very different way. At least according to this analysis of white supremacy culture, which I've been sitting with a lot. I've been having some conversations with colleagues of mine who have said restorative justice is harder for them as white people because they have been trained to think if they fix something, they will feel good. But they can't fully restore something that started with them being wrong. And so this wasn't necessarily the lane that I intended for us to go down, but I think one of the interesting things about sitting with this notion of reimagining what power looks like actually provides liberation for all of us. Because if we acknowledge that in the process of figuring this out, we're all going to get some things wrong. We're all going to be disruptive to the status quo. We're all going to take some heat from the institution that is trying to preserve itself. I think we end up with different allies. I was talking earlier about that notion of power with, and that's the idea of the power of community. In the work I've been doing in anti-racism in the past 5 years, I've started getting really clear on this isn't about good people and bad people. This is about people who are unaware of how systemic racism functions in their lives and people who are aware of it. And then it's about people who choose to do something about it and people who don't. Those are different dividing lines than we're used to having. And so what I love about that is it means if we're all making that choice together, and if we're committing to a relationship of trust with each other, it means that we can garner power in a very different way than the world is used to. I work with an organization out here called ACE. It's a tenants' rights organization in Oakland.
And Bay
one
Point,
of-
they're in our county too.
Oh, and Bay Point. That's exciting. I love knowing that. I didn't realize. That's great. Mostly low-income tenants of color, and they, in their rules of agreement, rules of engagement, dialogue agreements, one of their agreements is assume good intent. That's a choice based on, I believe we are showing up for a shared cause. I already know you're going to say some things that are going to land really badly with me. I'm going to trust that you didn't intend ill, which doesn't mean I'm going to ignore it. It means I'm going to let you know when you said something that hurt, because I believe we are committed to a shared future together. And when I bring those things up, you're going to know that's where it's coming from in my heart. And you're not going to crumble and fall apart and feel completely devastated that I mentioned that you were, that you got something wrong or that you caused me harm, because you know that I'm invested in you. Yeah, Diane.
That's what I feel like. If I could express my feelings on abortion, let's say, because I feel that if women could come together and realize that no woman wants abortion, no woman wants to make that decision, and if we could just stand together on that, somehow on that premise, then we will be able, with that shared experience, or maybe shared ideals, or assuming that we're both right, or if we can do that instead of putting the right against the left. And we're so often forced to put ourselves right against left in our culture.
And it's not just left and right where we're pitted against each other. It's also those that are trying to conserve culture or tradition, and those that are that have a worldview that everything needs to change, or that progress is inevitable, right? And that's the other danger for progressives, is thinking that everything has to be progressively better, or we're failing, rather than recognizing that our failing in the little things now might help us get better at the big things. If we're able to create a culture that allows us to practice new ways of being together without the expectations that we have to be successful in the future too, that whatever we create is going to be better than the past. History is up and down, and we want to say that it's always up. That is one of the biggest things getting in the way of really addressing climate change. Because we have a whole group of folks that think they're techno-optimists. We're going to find our way out of this. There's always going to be some light at the end of the tunnel for us to be able to fix this. And there may not be.
And it potentially discourages us from experimenting with things that aren't necessarily going to work out. That notion of,
or even experimenting with things that could be very detrimental to people on the other side of the planet, that we're willing to do for us despite the cost to other people.
No, that's true. So I love that we're wrestling with these questions, because I think the ways in which power has been defined for us sometimes limits our ability to imagine different ways of organizing a shared future. So I feel like this is really germane to the subject we're on. If you'll indulge me, I thought I was going to get through the content much more quickly than this. And we were going to have time for 3 rounds of small group conversation, which was ridiculous now that I look back on it. So I'm not going to have us discuss this question right now because I want to keep us pretty close to within time, but I want to invite you to think about, what does your faith tradition say about power? Who has power? How does it get used? And who has power might be people from within your sacred texts. And those sacred texts might tell stories of when power is used well and when power is used badly. But who has power might also be about how the sacred divine shows up in your texts and how the sacred divine uses power. When is power good and when is power bad in your faith tradition? I have the very good fortune that I was raised by a Hindu father and a Scottish Presbyterian mother. And so I have a very diverse array of stories about power being used for good and for ill, including by the divine even, which is not, I know, true for all traditions, but certainly is in some of the bedtime stories I got growing up. So I want you to think about what your faith tradition has to say about power. I bet it's not neutral on power. I bet there are times that it has a lot to say about how power should be used. There's a silent exercise that I would have loved for us to spend a little time reflecting on. Where do you have power? Power over, power with, power to, power within? How have you used it well? How have you used it badly? Where haven't you used it enough? Just a chance to reflect on those questions as we seek to be aware of where we have power in the face of the challenges we face individually or that our communities face. And I had a few exercises I had thought we could do. If we were thinking about a situation of personal racism, what would it look like to utilize the power to in order to respond to that situation? The illustration of personal racism I thought would be a fun case study to work on is somebody in the workplace saying, I don't feel comfortable with us moving our offices downtown. They're functioning out of an individual bias that is shaped by society around them, telling them how to understand downtown as in contrast with, say, the suburbs. If you had power to, individual power to affect change, what would it look like to address that person's racism? That was one of the little small group exercises I had thought we could try on. The next one I had thought we could do was looking at cultural racism and what we would do if we had power over, if we were in charge of a situation. The scenario I was imagining was an organization that was in a hiring process, and that the folks who were doing the hiring were wondering, how do we determine that a person is a good culture fit for our organization? The reason I would call that cultural racism is it is one of the ways that institutions resist change, is they work out of the assumption that individuals should fit the culture of the organization instead of recognizing that individuals might be valuable because they change the culture of the organization. And as a general rule, when organizations are talking about culture fit, they are talking about people who function in ways that align with a white supremacy culture that favors certain characteristics that are determined to be superior because they're related to historically how white culture has functioned in our society. If you had power over that process, what would you do to reorient that search committee's question about culture fit? I had thought that would be an interesting small group exercise. The last exercise I had thought we could do was around institutional racism and pondering what it would look like to use power with, or collective power. The case study I had thought we could look at, and we don't have time to, so I'm just going to tell you about it, is an organization or, and it could be a faith community, where clients, the people receiving services, don't shape or influence the policies of the organization that serves them. If we had other people in the organization who saw that as a problem, how would we utilize power with to change that in our organization's culture? I've got a closing reflection for us, but before I do that, we are at 8 o'clock and I want to honor our time. And so I just whirled through what obviously would have been an additional hour of content, because this is my weakness as a trainer. Yeah, an additional 2 hours. Absolutely. My biggest weakness as a trainer, every time I put something together, I'm like, oh, we'll get through that in an hour. And that was 100% a 3-hour training, according to Diane. And I think you're absolutely right. But I wonder if there were some thoughts or reflections or imaginings that came up for you as I shared with you what we would have done together if we lived in my fantasy world. Or anything that's come up for you. Yeah, sure.
I think it would have been
And then David.
very cool to kind of like almost a practice round on those difficult conversations. And because that's something that you need a lot of experience with, because they like just being able to do that in a safe space and talk
Yes.
about it with like-minded people who want the same kind of changes is really helpful.
Yeah. It's really good to get to have those conversations with folks who are like, oh yeah, what about this? So that when the real situation hits, sometimes when we're on
validation.
our own. Yeah, exactly. We
Yeah.
know we're not alone. Exactly. Yeah. Thank you. David.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the comments. I mean, the last two case studies were going to be effectively on culture and organizational culture and how that may not promote greater diversity because the culture is stuck in a white supremacy kind of mindset. I guess I would say, from my experience in being involved with a number of organizations over the years, I think some organizations don't have white supremacy cultures. I mean, I think some of them are, their values actually are very open to a wide, diverse group of employees. And in that case, I don't think you need to fight against the culture. But there are organizations that do try to preserve themselves, and their culture may be, I want to be around people that make me feel comfortable, as opposed to I want to be around people that are going to help us to grow and be successful, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, just that was a reaction to that, because it's almost came off like all these organizations are have a white supremacy sort of culture. I still think even when you don't have any white supremacy culture, that you say this is a really great culture. Even in that case, sometimes it's hard to get the kind of diversity that you would like to see, because if you're starting from a white base, that's the faces people see, and to try to break that apart is challenging. So I'm interested in your experience, and how do you move, even if there are no racist leanings, and even if the organization wants to be very diverse, how do you get from here to there?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And I think that's why institutional strategies are really important, because I think we underestimate how the rules determine the outcomes. A lot of organizations will say, yeah, our bylaws aren't explicitly anti-racist, but our practices are. And it turns out any organization that says that usually doesn't have the diversity that they want, because if and the theory is we never look at our bylaws anyhow, we never use them. And that might be part of the problem, because the only time bylaws get pulled out is to say, here's why we need to stop changing things, right? This gets into very complex terrain, but I think I want to be really clear that when I say white supremacy culture, I pastored an almost completely Black church, and I was a pastor of color, and we had white supremacy culture. So I don't want us to think that white supremacy culture means people who are wearing hoods and burning crosses. That's not what I mean when I say that. What I mean is a culture that has a bias towards efficiency over relationship, a culture that has a tendency to understand the way we navigate time in only one way, a culture that discourages dissent, a culture that does not know how to have conflict well and does it either in aggressive or passive aggressive ways, and doesn't know how to be honest about the differences we have. That can happen in organizations that are all people of color. Heck, I've led one, you know. So when I say white supremacy culture, I don't want us to mistake it for people who are explicitly biased, so much as all of us internalize it because our country was founded on it. And so it seeps into everything. My denomination did an anti-racism audit of our governing documents. And we rewrote our governing documents in the 1990s with a very intentional eye towards racial inclusion. But when we went back to look at the documents, what it said was the church and its racial ethnic ministries. And the reason that was there was to celebrate the Black and the Latino and the Asian ministries in our church. But what the people writing it didn't realize they were saying was the real church and then the people of color. That was the opposite of their intent. They did it in order to be more inclusive. And even in doing so, our governing documents for our denomination talk about a church and then people like me. So I know what that means. And it shapes the way we run our institution. And everybody I know within that institution deeply committed to inclusion. And even so, it shows up in some very complicated ways. So that's why I loved the question you asked, because it's one I was in charge of the task force on recognizing racist language in our governing documents, and it was the most miserable task I've ever been given, because I knew the people who wrote it, and they're beautiful people trying to make the world a better place.
Even our insistence on an educated clergy can be turned into white supremacy culture, because then that turns into the gatekeeping of who can make it through. And for generations, it was easier to just hire people that made it through the seminaries rather than people that were going through the hard knock life of commissioned lay pastors and taking classes on the weekends just to try to be a pastor.
Yeah, absolutely.
But didn't have the access to resources.
Yeah. Let me check and see if there were any other comments or questions or observations folks had.
I had a thought back when you were talking about institutional power and progressives. It occurred to me that a lot of progressives recognize that they need institutional power in order to make a change.
Yeah.
And so, people running for Congress and trying to, get people to register to vote and all that stuff. And I think that's really wonderful.
Yeah.
And then they run across people who use their power in really cruel and impossible, really awful ways, and they're not willing to do that.
Right.
The progressives are not willing to stoop to that level of power, and so I think they just need to get more and more people who vote and and take institutional power. But
yeah,
I don't think I want them to actually stoop to those levels
right.
of bad faith dealing. So anyway, that's what I had to thought.
I love that you mentioned that. I just finished, the Reverend Deb Lee and I just finished doing a 6-week course on faith-rooted organizing, which is wrestling with exactly that question: is the means and the ends have to be connected. using corrupt means to create a good end actually results in a corrupt end. And as a result, we really need to figure out how to invite the majority of goodwill to be more engaged. I think you're absolutely right. And to do so out of that commitment to doing good, but to doing it well. Yeah. So friends, I really appreciate you all sticking around beyond our time. I want to go ahead and close. Yeah. Ian, that's a great question. I have just built out a workshop on how to have conflict well for the purposes of engaging in anti-racism work, because I hadn't been doing it for years and years and years. And all of a sudden, all of my clients, all of the nonprofits are like, we got to figure out how to have these conversations because people are afraid to, because they're afraid of hurting each other or getting hurt. And they have a long history of reasons for feeling that way. So gaining the knowledge and terminology to have the tough conversations, it's also, yes, difficult conversations, crucial conversations is actually the one that I've been using. The thing you need to do with both of those books, they're both excellent. Difficult Conversations, Crucial Conversations, both excellent books. You need to bring your own anti-racism analysis to them because they don't have them in them. But they are excellent resources for how do we have the hard conversations. And if you can bring an anti-oppression lens to them, that can be helpful. The other thing I want to mention is if any of you are not familiar with the Aorta Collective, they're an anti-oppression resource organization. On the resources tab on their webpage, they have a whole section on how organizations unintentionally do conflict badly and resources to do hard conversations well, and how to institutionalize those practices. It's an amazing resource. It's one of the best ones I've found out there. I put it into conversation with Crucial Conversations and it's beautiful.
Say it again. What was that resource?
The Aorta, like in the heart, AORTA Collective. The resources tab on their page, thank you, is such a great resource for exactly that question that you asked. All right, I'm gonna see if I can get us out of here only 15 minutes late. I would love to close us out with this reflection from Alice Walker, because it feels like it is at the heart of what is possible as well as what is hard. So what Alice Walker, and it's an adaptation from that, but it is the worst of times. It is the best of times. It is the worst of times because it feels as though the very earth is being stolen from us. The land and air poisoned, the animals disappeared, humans degraded and misguided. War and oppression are everywhere. It is the best of times because we have entered a period, if we can bring ourselves to pay attention, of great clarity as to cause and effect. It is as if ancient graves hidden deep in the shadows of the psyche and the earth are breaking open of their own accord, unwilling to be silent any longer, incapable of silence. No leader or people of any country will be safe from these upheavals that lead to exposure, no matter how much the news is managed or how long people's grievances have been kept quiet. It is an awesome era in which to live. It was the poet June Jordan who wrote, "We are the ones we have been waiting for." We are the ones we've been waiting for because we are able to see what is happening with a much greater awareness than our parents or grandparents, our ancestors could see. This does not mean we believe, having seen the greater truth of how all oppression is connected, how pervasive and unrelenting, that we can fix things. But some of us are not content to have a gap in opportunity and income that drives a wedge between rich and poor, not willing to ignore brutalized children, not willing to let segregation and discrimination destroy our society, not willing to disappear into our flower gardens cul-de-sacs or the illusion of independence. We have wanted all our lives to know that Earth, who has somehow obtained human beings as her custodians, was also capable of creating humans who could minister to her needs and the needs of her creation. We are the ones. To me, that's a testimony to power with and power to and power within that we all have the potential to carry within us. Thank you, friends, so much for this conversation. I loved getting to be with you this evening.